This story time is about a woman named Stella. I'm Cerise. Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Storytime. Well, guys, sit back. I hope you have your beverage and maybe a little snack because this is actually an interesting yet scary story. Okay, so there's a woman named Stella, and when she was born to her mother and her father, and they stayed together and they were in a really good family. When she was 10 years old, her mom had another little girl, and they named that little girl Teresa. Teresa and Stella were very close. Now, when Stella started to date, the father made it very clear that he did not want her dating outside of their Caucasian Canadian race. And she was very, very obedient. She did not date out of her race. Now, Teresa, she was a whole different story. She really liked dark-skinned men. And she was dating men from Guyana, from Trinidad, and everything from the time she was 15 and all through high school, because the parents lived near a place called Jane and Finch. It was more like the hood, and they bought a home near that area in Toronto. But you see, Stella, like I said, she was very obedient. Teresa, she used to go to the community centers all the time. She would go watch the guys play basketball. She was always dating them, hanging out with them, and her father was always angered by this, triggered by it, until he just kind of gave up on it. And he was like, you know what? Just don't bring any men home and don't go get pregnant. And she didn't at first. But when she was 18 and she graduated high school, her father said to her, he kept saying from the time she entered high school, because she was always skipping school, her dad was always so, hard on her, and he would just pretty much be an alcoholic, and she didn't really want to have anything to do with the lifestyle at her home. So she would never go home. And her dad said, listen, don't fail school. If you stay in school, then I will buy you a ticket anywhere you want to go on vacation. And she was like, all right. And so he said, but you have to take your sister Stella with you. And that was not a problem. She was 18 and Stella was 28. Stella was just meeting her husband at the time, her boyfriend at the time, named Rob. And when she was meeting Rob, he worked in a factory. He was 5 years older than her. He was everything that her father wanted her to marry. He worked in a place in Oshawa for the GM factory. And back in the day, if you got a job there, you were doing good. The pay was good, and the hours were good, and so was the pension in the end. People had jobs there for a good 25 years or more. And that's exactly where Rob worked for that many amount of years. Now, he would always go back home with Stella, and he had a little bit of a drinking problem from the beginning, much like Stella's father. But Stella seemed to be okay with it. She got married very young. But you see, when she was 28 and when Teresa was 28, Teresa graduated from high school, and the two girls went to Jamaica. That's where they wanted to go. Well, that's where Teresa wanted to go for her graduation. They get to Jamaica, and Teresa fell in love with a man her age, a young man. And, Stella was like, oh my gosh, no, because she was supposed to be on vacation with Teresa in order to tell Teresa no men. But she fell in love with a guy. And now Stella didn't have anything against the guy. The guy seemed pretty nice and honest. And then, they were only there for a week anyway. And then they got back to Toronto. And Teresa and this gentleman, let's call him Gabriel, they stayed in touch. And they kept in touch through calling cards and everything. We're going back 20 years ago. So they kept in touch through calling cards, and they kept in touch through the internet as the internet increased, and then, just through telephone once mobiles really started to take effect in Jamaica. So Teresa, she would send all her money to this gentleman, Gabriel. Gabriel said to Teresa, listen, if you send me money, I can buy a taxi and I can start a taxi business for us while you're working in Canada. And Teresa believed in him, and she sent him money for the taxi company. Now, hold on. You may be trying to predict this. Don't try to predict it. It's not like your old story of a Sankey Panky or a gold digger or like, a gigolo. Gabriel is actually an angel. But we'll get to that. So he was honest. And he put that money away. Every single cent that he could, he saved from the taxi. So he would put all the money away and he would put it in a box in his mother's house. Now, Teresa, she would go down and visit Jamaica all the time. One year she went 18 times. She had a really good job doing sales. She was selling pharmaceutical stuff, pharmaceutical medicines to doctors. So she had a really good cush gig, and she would go back and forth to Jamaica all the time. As a matter of fact, through her work, they would give her free trips around the world, and she always chose to go to Jamaica. Now, back to Stella. Now, it was about 5 years. And here, Teresa was still living with her parents in Canada. She wasn't sending for Gabriel to take Gabriel to Canada. Gabriel didn't want to go to Canada. He was building the business. In 5 years, they had 3 taxi cabs. So now they had a taxi cab company. Then they were renting out these taxi cabs to other people who were driving for them. Not only that, because Teresa was good at sales, she would use her connections with hotels and stuff of that nature to use her taxis as, like she would get one of the bar manager. If he had a friend that, like a client or someone on the resort that wanted a cab, he would contact one of her cabs and they would get a kickback on that. So she was making really good money with the business side, and Gabriel, he was just working it on the mechanical side, just making sure the cars were good and everything. Now Stella, she's watching this, and inside she's waiting for Rob to start doing more. And she's thinking, oh my gosh, this guy in Jamaica is doing so much more for my sister. And she just couldn't hold it together with Rob. They had a child, and then they had another one. And at this point, she was 35 years old. 2 children, very unhappy. Rob was drinking every single night. He would go home every night with a 12-pack. He would drink the 12-pack until he fell asleep in front of the TV. And he was always miserable. He would get the girls. They had 2 daughters. He would get the girls to go get him a drink out of the fridge constantly. They would open it up. Sometimes he'd let them take a sip. And she was always fighting with him, saying, don't let the girls drink alcohol. These were little 2-3-year-olds, And he was always throwing his cans at her, and when he was drunk, and he couldn't even make it to the bedroom. Sometimes he would go and pee in the closet thinking he was peeing in the toilet. It was a whole hot mess going on in that house. And speaking of mess, he never cleaned. He would just spit on the floor. He was just a very nasty man. And so she was tired of him, but she didn't know how to get rid of him. And every year she would get a break from him. And she would go with her sister, like a yearly tradition they made. The year after that time she went to Jamaica with her sister, she would only go once a year. She'd go back once a year. And she'd always stay on the resort. And she'd never go off the resort. And her sister would always invite her, but she would never go. And then, at times, what happened was her sister eventually ended up moving to Jamaica, and she built a villa down there, and they had a really good cab company going on and a restaurant happening, and a lot of good things she was doing with Gabriel. And they still are together doing very well. And they started to do Airbnbs and rent out stuff as the years passed on. And so Stella, here she is, very unhappy. And then she finds out that Rob decides to have an affair. Rob finally gets a promotion at the plant. And what does he do? Like at the factory plant, GM. And what does he do? In his new promotion, he's working alongside a younger woman, and he ends up cheating with her and leaving Stella with the children. Now, Stella, she was just relieved. She was like, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. And he was paying child support and everything. But then the young woman ended up leaving him for someone else at work. So he went back to Stella crying and asked Stella to take him back. And Stella took him back because the girls, they cried, and the girls were completely out of hand. They weren't listening to her. They were always hitting her and yelling at her. And by this time, they were also teenagers. So young teenagers, teeny boppers. So she said, yes, you know what, Rob, come back home, but you need to cut down on the drinking, and you need to start treating me with more respect, and you need to help me around the house with the girls. That was the deal. And it lasted for 2 months. And then he fell off the wagon, and he was back on and off, and he was just binge drinking from there on in. Now, also, he was cheating on her left and right. And she heard about the little rumors here and there. She found like little pieces of paper in his pocket from newspaper clippings from working girls, that he would go visit, escorts, stuff like that. And she was on to him, but they weren't intimate anyway, and she felt very lonely. And then, her sister, like moving down there in Jamaica, she would go down there to visit her sister every year, and she would take her friend with her. And her friend would stay on the resort. But then eventually, she just felt within herself that, leaving her husband was going to be the best thing. And by this point, her children were still mean to her. Both of her children are grown children. One of her girls was 18 at the time, and the other one was 17. Both of them were pregnant. Both of them went and moved out with their boyfriends. So Stella found herself at home alone all the time. Her husband out cheating, her daughters out on their own, and she heard all the rumors because the women that her husband was cheating with was all from the plant. And her daughter, she knew as well, both of her daughters, because one of her daughters worked at the plant, the GM plant, and then the other daughter, her husband worked there. So they were all part of that whole GM family, in Oshawa. So this is what went on. And so Stella, she had enough, but she didn't know what to do with herself. She came close now to just taking her life. And then she just decided that there's nothing else she can do. So she picked up and she told Rob that, oh, wait. Rob's mom died. And when Rob's mom died, she left everything to Rob. Everything. Her home, her $1 million home in Woodbridge, and everything. So Rob had all that now. And what did Stella do? Stella took him for everything. Oh, half of everything. And it was on the grounds of him cheating and how he was treating her. So now she turns around and she's like, you know what, buddy boy? We are not going to be together any longer. I had enough. And she's like, bye-bye. And she divorced him, took what her half was worth, and she got over $1 million because they also sold their home, everything. She got half of the $1 million from the home itself, the sale of the mother's home, her mother-in-law's home, and then they sold their home. Their home was worth a good amount as well. And then they also sold their cars, everything. She sold off everything and moved to Jamaica. When she got to Jamaica, she moved into the neighborhood of where her sister lived, where her sister's Airbnbs were. She thought at first, she'll do a little bit of resort, but Her sister encouraged her to buy something in the neighborhood the sister had Airbnbs in. Now, there were some times throughout the years that Stella would visit Jamaica that she would go into the communities, and she always felt relatively safe. And a lot of the people knew her, and her sister always stayed in the same area anyway. So every time she'd show up, the kids would run up to her, people would come up to her, and every time she visited, she'd also take gifts for people that she knew over the years. Now, she had one friend over the years that was her age, an older Jamaican woman, and she went and she bought a house near that woman. So, close to that woman. So, she could have a friend there, and she could also have, her sister in the area. Well, it was a fixer-upper, her place. So here she is trying to fix this, trying to fix that. Her friend next door was trying to help her, but her friend next door was aging and she now had diabetes. Her friend next door was her age, but she was a little bit, unhealthy. So Stella started to go on the internet and she started to look how she can fix the place up herself, because every single handyman that she would call to go and fix up her place, they would say they're going to show up and then they wouldn't. When they did show up, it was out of the blue. So she finally just said, you know what? I'm going to do this on my own. So she was trying to put some lights out on her porch, like string of lights, and a Rastaman walked by and he saw her almost fall, and he went over to her and he said, hey, he said, listen, there's a right way to do that and there's a wrong way to do that, and I'm pretty sure right now the way you're doing it is not the right way. And she said, oh, I know, I really need help right here. I don't have any clue what I'm doing. And she's like, look, and she showed him her cell phone and the YouTube video, and he's like, okay, I won't be needing that, but I can help you. And she's like, thank you. He helped her. And then he looked around after he put the lights up, and he could see that there was a lot of work that needed to be done. So he went and he did a few things in the garden, and then he hammered down a few things, and then he just looked at her and he's like, listen, the day passed and he finished doing everything, and he looked at her and he said, listen, do you have paint and any kind of cement or anything like that? And she was like, no. And he's like, okay, go get it tomorrow. And he's like, it's late, I'm going home, I'm going to eat. And he said, just get some paint tomorrow. And he said, give me your number, I'm going to text you what you need to get, and then you get that tomorrow morning at the at the place, the hardware store. And when you go to the hardware store, you just tell them that you're getting it on my account. And she's like, why? And he said, I get a discount for it. And she's like, oh, okay. So then she went into the house. She's like, hold on a second. She went into the house and she came back out and she gave him a $20 bill. And he's like, what's that for? And she's like, for your services. And he's like, no, I got money. And she's like, oh, okay. And he's like, okay, so how about 3 o'clock tomorrow? I come back here, you get those supplies, and I'll help you out a little bit more. You need some work done on your home here, and it'll be easy to do. And she's like, oh, all right. So he left. Let's give him a name. Let's call him Keith. My dad was Aras, and my dad's name was Keith. His nickname was Keeper. Anyway, fun fact about me, or my dad, I should say. So his name, let's name him Keith. So Keith goes back to her place the next day at 3 o'clock, and she has all the supplies ready, and she's like, here, I got them. And she was so happy. And, by the way, Keith is 10 years younger than her. So, he starts fixing everything. And so she says to him, can I at least get you a drink or make you something to eat? And he's like, do you know how to cook? And she's like, well, just because I'm white doesn't mean I don't know how to cook and throw down. She's like, let me make something good for you. Tell me if you like it. And he's like, is it Canadian food? And she's like, yeah, but try it and you might like it. So she made him some Canadian food, and he really enjoyed it. I guess she made him steak and potatoes and some green beans or whatever. And he ate it and he loved it. They sat down, and when he finished that night, he asked her, he said, "Do you mind if I shower at your place? I'm so sorry to ask, but the water's not running over by my place right now." And she was like, "Yeah, of course, no worries." And he took a shower, and then, he had extra clothing in his bag anyway. It wasn't a setup. He just had extra clothing in his bag because he always took extra clothing with him all the time. In his car, he always had an extra set of clothing just in case. So, and not just in case because he was meeting a woman, but just in case, he had to change and go somewhere. This man owned and owns his own construction company. And so anyway, he took a shower that night. They ended up having a couple of glasses of wine, and they talked and they talked and they laughed, and they chilled out. And he was like, he's like, "I enjoy your company. Do you mind if I take you out to dinner this weekend?" And she was like, "Oh my gosh, that would be so nice to just get out of the house and go look around the town and see what's really happening." And he took her around the town, and then he took her around the town again, and the two of them fell in love, and really in love. And he was not using her, and she was not being used. So now let's fast forward. Her daughter comes down because she wants to know where her mom is. She wants to bring the kids down. Her daughter has a kid, remember? And then so her daughter goes down, and her daughter's staying with her. Now, her daughter still hasn't changed at all. And here's Stella, in the house, and something happened with the kid, and Stella's daughter, Teresa, smacks Stella in the face in front of Keith. Keith jumped up. Now, let's say what happened again. Stella's daughter was visiting her. Something happened to the granddaughter, and Stella's daughter slapped Stella. A full-grown woman hit her mother, slapped her in the face really hard, and yelled at her. Keith saw it, and he couldn't believe it. Keith couldn't believe his eyes or his ears. He went right over to Stella's daughter, and he said to her, don't you ever lay your hands on my wife again." And she said, "Your wife? That's my mother. That's not your wife." He said, "That is my wife." And he looked at Stella and he said, "Will you marry me?" And Stella was like, "Of course." And that was it. It was sounds kind of corny, right? But at that moment, he just felt like that was his wife. And he looked at her and he said, "Will you be my wife?" And she said, "Yes, I will." And that was it. And then the daughter, she took off. She booked a flight for the next day, and she went back to Canada. She was more like her grandfather. Was more into her own kind. A lot of the family used to call the sister Teresa names for dating outside of her family, what her family would prefer her to date. So, this daughter of Stella's went back to Canada. When she was in Canada, she cut Stella off for about a year. Stella didn't mind. But then, Stella was getting married, and she wanted her daughters to be at the wedding and her grandchildren. So she called her daughter, and she begged her daughter to come down to the Caribbean. And she said, "Please, can you come down? I'll pay for your tickets. I'm going to make sure I take care of everything. You don't have to stay with me and Keith. You can stay on a resort. It will be 5-star. I'll pay for your boyfriend. I'll pay for everyone. I just really want my grandchildren there." So the two daughters went to Jamaica with their boyfriends and stayed in a 5-star hotel. Now, the night that Stella was getting married to Keith, it was a very special night. Everyone loved it. Everyone except for the one daughter that Keith yelled at. Now, keep in mind, I forgot something actually. When Keith yelled at the daughter, Keith said to the daughter, "Who do you think you are? You're a full-grown woman. You need to take care of your child. And if you took care of your child, then your child would not have hurt herself. Look at you. You need to get up off your butt. You're lazy. You're fat. You have nothing. And this is what he said to the daughter, right? Forgot to put that in. So that's what happened that night, right? And the daughter took off. The daughter was very hurt, and that was it. But now the daughter, when she returns, she's angry at Keith. She feels like Keith is just mean, and she can't forgive him. So she gets drunk the night of the wedding. The story's coming to an end. The night of the wedding, she gets so drunk that she's falling over everywhere. And, Keith goes up to her, and Keith says, listen, you're ruining this night for your mother. Please, either sit down and have a bite to eat, stop drinking, or go back to the hotel, and we'll make sure that we have a ride for you and you get home safe. And she said, you can't make me leave my mother's wedding. And he said, this is not only your mother's wedding, this is my wedding too. And I have family here, and you're making a spectacle of yourself. So please. And she went over to her mother in front of everyone, and she spit in her mother's face. And then she looked at Keith and she said, I didn't smack her. I guess you'll be happy with that. And then everyone went quiet. And that's when her Aunt Teresa went over to her and said, sweetie, I think you need to leave. And she called one of her taxi drivers, and she said, come, please take my niece home. My niece needs to rest. And then Stella's daughter said, who do you think you are? You're the one that got my mom down here with that man. My mom only came here to copy you and what you're doing. And then she called her an N-word lover. And then she said, I'll get home on my own. And she left. And she ran out. And when she got outside, she got on a moto. The key was in the moto, and she got on a moto, like a moped, and she started to drive. Now, at this point, obviously everyone was just kind of still quiet, but just starting to talk. And that's when Stella got up, and Stella went after her, and they said, no, Stella, just leave her alone. But Stella knew that her daughter was really drunk. So she got into a car, and she was like, come on, let's go. Like this to the driver, like this to one of the cabbies. And, he was like, all right, let's go. And they followed behind. Now, at one point, Stella had woman's intuition, mother's intuition. And she said she felt like a stab in her womb, in her gut. And she was like, and she felt like something happened. And so she said to the driver, you know what? Turn around. Let's just go back to the party. This is my wedding. And at that moment, she felt like her daughter might have had an accident. She felt like something happened, and she wasn't quite sure. But at that moment, she was tired of the drama, and she was sick of all of the pain that her daughter was putting her through. And so she ended up going back to her wedding. Now, this location was up in the mountains, overlooking beautiful oceans and everything. It was like cabanas galore. It was gorgeous. Now, her daughter, being on a moto, she obviously went over the cliff, right? If there was an accident. And that's exactly what happened. The next day, her body was found. And Stella said she was very happy with that, because not only was her body found, her boyfriend was about to dump her anyway, because he found out that that baby was not his. The daughter, the granddaughter. So the daughter, Stella's daughter, had a daughter, remember? So that daughter ended up not even being the father. Stella's, I'm confusing you guys. Stella had a daughter. That was the one that was all pissy. And then she also had a daughter. So Stella's daughter cheated on her own boyfriend, right? And it wasn't his child. He found that out, and nobody knew who the father was. And so He left the baby right there in Jamaica with Stella. He said, listen, this is all too much for me. Like, he sat down with Stella and he said to Stella, listen, your daughter was a handful. I was done with her. And when I found out that that's not my daughter, as much as I love her, there's just too much hurt and pain in me to stay. And he said, I was going to leave her after the trip. He's like, but now I'm just looking at this as a sign. He's like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound cold. I just really need some time. If I can still help raise this little girl that I thought was my daughter, I don't know what to do right now. But if she can just stay with you, please. And let me just figure out what I'm going to do when I get back to Canada. And Stella was like, yes. For Stella, it was a blessing in disguise. She knew that her granddaughter was being raised in a home where the cycle was being continued. Her mom, like Stella's daughter, the granddaughter's mom, was drinking like the father used to and just mean like the father was. And it wasn't a good environment for the little girl to be raised in, and Stella's heart was aching because she remembered what it was like when she was married to her husband and the way she used to feel sorry for her children being raised in that environment, and she definitely didn't want her granddaughter in the same conditions. And then when Stella was younger as well, she can remember her dad drinking a lot and very ignorant in his ways, and she never enjoyed it. She just obliged by it to keep the peace in the family. But when she saw Teresa and how Teresa was so happy and how Teresa was being like raising her own children with politeness and also with just a lot of culture and love, she wanted her granddaughter to be raised like that too. So for her, again, it was a blessing in disguise. And so now her granddaughter is being raised with her, and her granddaughter is being taught by her and also by the Rastaman, and she has a lot of family down there. Keith has his own kids as well, but they're like older teenagers, and so they love taking Stella's granddaughter around, and they treat her so good, like a part of the family. And this has been a double life for her that she feels was her first life. She feels like if she didn't listen to her dad when it came to Rob, she would have been able to follow her own heart. She feels like if she was able to be given the choice as well to choose what she wanted, she would not have picked a man like Rob. So there we go. At the end of the day, what would you say? What would you do? That whole family cycle thing is really painful, and it is always difficult to cut that cycle loose. Most people have to do it within themselves. Most people have to stand back and analyze what is good in their family and what is toxic and unhealthy, and not repeat the same mistakes, but learn. I think most people, they tend to blame their family and they tend to feel negative about it, but there's just such an easy way to get away from it, and you just cut the cycle by cutting yourself away. You still love your family, you still honor your family, but you love them for the good things they have, because no one person is all bad. There are people who are the worst in life, but there's something kind about them or something good about them. Even if it's not a good moralistic way they lead their life, it could be something good that you can, think of them with instead of thinking negative about them. Sometimes when we think about people and we only think about negativity around them, it makes negativity around us. So try to find the one beautiful thing about your family that you love, but get away from the toxic entities. Move away from anything that is uncomfortable emotionally. You don't need that in your life, but still give love and support and kindness. Well, guys, what was that story all about? Very interesting. Oh, it's got to be tough to be Stella. Let's pull some cards on a few things from this story. Let's pull on and see if the child, Stella's granddaughter, will be raised well. Oh, she definitely will. She'll be raised with a lot of celebration, a lot of love, a lot of togetherness, and she will be happy. She will find a lot of determination in life to go for her goals. She will be confident and peaceful. Let's look to see how Stella feels right now in regards to her decision to not go back and check on her daughter. No, she feels two ways about it. Some days she feels bad. Some days she feels like it was something she did that was logical. She feels emotional about it. And she also feels like there was not much she can do if her daughter had already fallen off that cliff. Let's go and see if she actually told Keith. She did. She told Keith. She was honest with him, and she wanted to be honest with him in order for him to understand her part in the situation. It's not like she drove her daughter off the cliff. She just knew at that moment that her daughter had driven off the cliff. Now let's pull three more cards on the daughter. Let's pull on if the daughter deliberately went off the cliff. No, she didn't. She thought about it. She was very emotional. She was very angry at her mother, very disconnected from the family, but she didn't try to hurt herself. Let's pull now on what if Stella did stop? Could she have saved her daughter? Yes, she could have saved her daughter. She would have been able to save her daughter's life. Let's look at the last card and let's ask if her daughter is in a better place now. Yes, her daughter is much more balanced, and although the situation is so sad, nobody wants to lose a child, and I'm it's not even it's there's no words to say for it really. But at the end of the day, the daughter's torment is gone, and she will now be an angel over her daughter and over Stella. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. This was a sad story, but the tarot and story time is for you to think about life and for you to think about how you could change things while you still have the chance. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much for subscribing. Huge hugs, loads of love, big blesses. Treat yourself good today. You deserve it.